The room went silent when she questioned his dosage. Not awkward silence. Predatory silence. The kind that happens when someone challenges authority in front of an audience who has learned not to challenge anything. Dr. Sterling's eyes narrowed behind his wire-rimmed glasses as Danielle Ross stood at the medication cart, holding the vial of digoxin up to the fluorescent light, her voice level and clinical. The ejection fraction improved to 48%. We should consider reducing the dose. Not a question. An observation. A suggestion that his protocol, refined over 15 years as chief of surgery at Oak Creek Memorial, might benefit from reconsideration by a woman in scrubs who had been a nurse for 18 years and nothing more. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that made younger residents take notes. Your concern is noted, Ms. Ross. We'll continue with the current regimen. He turned to the cardiology fellow beside him. Make a note that our floor nurse has opinions about cardiac management. The word landed like a scalpel. Opinions. The kind of thing nurses had the same way they had feelings, present but irrelevant. She did not flush. She did not lower her eyes. She capped the vial and returned it to the drawer with the same precision she'd used to handle it, her movements flowing like water finding its level. That restraint infuriated him more than if she had argued. He made another note on his tablet. First one had been about the trembling. He had noticed it 3 days ago when she started her shift on the intensive care unit, a slight tremor in her left hand as she drew up medications, barely perceptible but there. She had steadied it by gripping the counter, an old habit that told him she knew about it, was compensating for it, was vulnerable about it. In Sterling's experience, vulnerability was an opening. He had spent 15 years at Oak Creek Memorial building a reputation on excellence and authority so absolute that not a single nurse, resident, or attending questioned his decisions. The hospital board loved him. Insurance companies loved him. Families of post-operative patients loved him because he had a gift for making them believe that survival was a privilege he granted, not a medical outcome. A tremor in the hand of a middle-aged nurse who asked questions during rounds was the kind of detail that could be weaponized. He had already begun cataloging the others, the way she lingered over certain patient files, the way her voice changed when she talked about combat-related injuries, the way she had volunteered immediately when Commander Blake Torres was admitted to ICU with 7 bullet wounds, trauma entry points suggesting an execution attempt that somehow, impossibly, he had survived. Oak Creek Memorial's ICU hummed with the white noise of 11 simultaneous ventilators and the rhythmic percussion of heart monitors, antiseptic smell layered over something older, the smell of bodies fighting against biology, of fluids, and fear and the exhaustion that comes from being kept alive by machines. Danielle moved through this landscape like someone who had memorized its topography years ago. She did not rush. She did not appear harried or overburdened. Even though her assignment had been deliberately increased that morning, Sterling had made a quiet call to the charge nurse about better coverage distribution. Danielle had not complained. She simply adapted, her hands moving with the kind of muscle memory that only came from thousands of repetitions. Check the ventilator settings. Ensure the endotracheal tube was positioned correctly. Monitor the arterial line, the central venous catheter, the Foley, the chest tube draining what remained of Torres's collapsed lung. Each task completed with the precision of someone who understood that mistakes in the ICU did not result in learning opportunities, they resulted in death. Her jacket hung on the back of her chair in the break room, the lining catching on the edge of a drawer when she'd hung it that morning. Nobody had noticed except Sterling, who had been watching the parking lot from his office window when she arrived. He had seen the fabric snag and the glimpse of embroidered insignia, not hospital insignia, not nursing board certification, but something older. Something military. A patch, faded to the color of old blood. He had filed that detail away with the others. The trembling hands. The questions during rounds. The way she moved with tactical assessment rather than nursing assessment. The way her fingers had paused over Commander Torres's scars as if she recognized them. The way she had whispered something in Spanish to another patient, no, not Spanish, something guttural and angular, words with the sharp edges of Dari or Pashto or one of the other languages spoken in places where Americans went to kill and die. He made another note. This one had a different quality than the others. This one was a question: who exactly are you? Commander Blake Torres arrived at Oak Creek Memorial on a Tuesday at 11:17 in the morning, airlifted from the scene by a Coast Guard MH-6 Little Bird with 3 trauma surgeons riding in the cabin trying to keep him alive during the 42-minute flight from the Naval Air Facility. 7 bullet wounds. Entry and exit, the medical team reported, which meant 7 separate occasions when his body had been struck by projectiles traveling at roughly 2,800 feet per second. The entry wounds were small and precise. The exit wounds were large enough to fit fingers through. He had been conscious for none of it, sedated by the field team, intubated by Sterling himself in the emergency department, his right lung already being drained by a chest tube the color of a blackened rose. The surgical team expected him to be dead within 72 hours. The infection risk alone was catastrophic. Trauma like that did not result in survivors. It resulted in cadavers for the trauma surgeons to use as teaching examples. Danielle was the one who volunteered to take his care. She had been standing at the supply counter when Sterling announced the admission, and she had simply said, "I'll take the Torres assignment," not a question, not a request, a statement of fact delivered in the same neutral tone she used to confirm medication counts or report lab values. Something in Sterling's face had tightened at those words, some small signal that he did not want her near this particular patient, but he could not have explained why to the charge nurse without revealing the surveillance he had been conducting, the file he was building, the plan that was already taking shape in his mind. Danielle had simply begun the intake process, checking every vital sign twice, asking the transport team detailed questions about the exact sequence of events, the medications administered, the oxygen saturation trends during flight. She had studied the imaging, the CT scan showing the trajectory of the wounds, the positioning of the bullets, the shrapnel still embedded near the subclavian artery. And then she had done something Sterling had never seen her do before. She had closed her eyes and simply breathed. Not meditation. Something harder. Something that looked like remembering. Her hands did not tremble as she worked Torres's care. That was the first thing that registered. Sterling observed her from the doorway of the ICU bay, expecting to see that slight tremor reappear under stress, anticipating weakness that never came. Instead, her movements were fluid and confident, each action flowing into the next with the terrifying precision of someone operating from pure instinct rather than conscious thought. She repositioned the central venous catheter with the kind of technical skill that usually required 10 years of critical care experience, not the 18 years of floor nursing her resume listed. She assessed the pericardial sac with a thoroughness that suggested she understood exactly what she was looking for: cardiac tamponade, the slow filling of fluid that could compress the heart and stop it cold. She knew. She knew that Torres was not just injured. Torres was in the process of dying from something that would not show on any standard monitor. Something that required assessment so subtle and so specific that only someone who had seen it before would know to look. Sterling made his notes. And then he began to construct the narrative that would remove Danielle Ross from Torres's care before she could do whatever she was already planning to do. He did not yet know what that plan was. But he knew with absolute certainty that it did not align with his own interests. And in his 15 years as chief of surgery, in his carefully constructed empire of authority and control, that misalignment was the only signal he needed to begin dismantling her. That evening, as Danielle finished her charting, she reached for her jacket. The lining caught on the corner of her medication card, just as it had that morning, and the patch came free from its stitching. For exactly 3 seconds, she did not move. She simply stared at the faded embroidery, a Coast Guard insignia, Special Operations crossed with something older, something from a war that had officially never happened. The stitching was meticulous and precise, the work of someone who understood that this patch had to survive 50 years of washing and exposure to survive at all. She touched it once with her fingertip, the way a person might touch something sacred. Then she restitched it with hands that did not shake, muscle memory moving her fingers through movements she had performed exactly this way for 2 decades. The needle and thread appeared from her locker. She had learned long ago to carry what she needed, to never depend on the assumption that anyone would provide what mattered most. Sterling watched from the corridor, his phone recording video at 42 frames per second, capturing exactly what he needed to capture. A nurse engaged in some kind of ritualistic behavior. A woman with military insignia. A person who did not fit the narrative of the role she occupied. He smiled to himself. Tomorrow, he would begin. Tomorrow, he would start the process of making sure that everyone at Oak Creek Memorial understood that Danielle Ross was unstable, unreliable, a liability rather than an asset. And by the time she realized what was happening, it would be too late to stop it. The trembling in her hands, the questions during rounds, the military patch hidden in the lining of her jacket, all of it would become evidence. Evidence of someone operating outside her scope, outside her authority, outside the careful boundaries that kept nurses in their place and surgeons like Sterling in control of everything that mattered. He had no idea that he was standing next to the woman who had held a field hospital together alone for 16 hours under sustained fire. He had no idea that those trembling hands had sutured arteries with rounds impacting the sandbags above her head. He had no idea that the military patch represented a Navy Cross that she had been unable to receive because officially she had never been there. But he was about to find out. Morning rounds at Oak Creek Memorial moved like clockwork, Dr. Sterling's clockwork. Danielle stood at the foot of Commander Torres's bed, checking the fall line while his parents sat rigid in the corner chairs, their faces carved from worry and hope. Sterling swept in at 0800 sharp, his white coat pressed knife-edged, his voice already pitched for an audience. "Nurse Ross," he said, not looking at her. "Perhaps you could explain to Commander Torres's parents why their son's antibiotic was administered at 0802 instead of 0800? 2 minutes late. A small detail, I'm sure, but precision is rather foundational to nursing, wouldn't you say?" The room held its breath. Sterling turned to Torres's mother with practiced sympathy, the kind of concern that looked real under fluorescent light. "We've been addressing some competency issues with our more seasoned staff. Nothing to worry about, of course. The commander is in capable hands now that we're monitoring more closely." Danielle's jaw tightened. Not a muscle moved in her face. She'd taken fire in Kandahar. She'd held pressure on wounds while rounds snapped past her head. She could absorb a condescending comment from a doctor in Norfolk without flinching. One measured breath. That's all it took. She looked at Torres, whose eyes had gone flat, the same flat they went when he was in pain and didn't want to show it. The 0800 dose was scheduled for 0802 because the commander's wound assessment at 0759 revealed early septic indicators, Danielle said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "I prioritized clinical assessment over arbitrary timing." Sterling's smile sharpened like a scalpel finding an incision line. "That's exactly the kind of insubordination I'm documenting." He pulled out a form, already filled, already waiting, and placed it on the bedside table. "Sign here, please." She signed. His pen hovered above the paper. "Your tremble," he started, then caught himself, watching her hands. Steady. Not a flicker. His eyes narrowed. He'd been counting on the trembling, on the shaking hands of someone about to break. Instead, he found stone. Torres's mother looked away. His father stared at his shoes. By that afternoon, Danielle sat alone in the break room with a container of leftover pasta, her lunch tray isolated at a table built for 8. The room had been full 10 minutes ago, 3 nurses debating the new ventilator protocols, one resident laughing at something on his phone. The moment she sat down, conversations died like engines cutting out. One nurse suddenly needed to refill her coffee. Another checked her pager urgently. The resident found an excuse to take a call in the hallway. Within 60 seconds, she sat in silence, steam rising from her pasta like a ghost nobody wanted to see. Sterling entered 17 minutes later. He surveyed the empty chairs, his gaze settling on her for exactly long enough to make sure she understood the void was intentional. "I see Florence Nightingale is holding court again," he announced to nobody in particular, loud enough for everyone in the adjacent hallway to hear. "Careful, everyone. Delusions might be contagious." The 2 remaining nurses stared at their food with sudden intensity. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked at Danielle. The absence of their eye contact was louder than any insult. She finished her pasta. Rinsed her container. Left the room still holding her spine straight, the kind of straight that comes from learning, very young, that your dignity was the only thing they couldn't take if you didn't hand it to them first. By Friday, Sterling's campaign had escalated to architectural precision. He posted her performance review on the unit board, the one all 237 staff members passed during their shifts. Not in a folder. Not in her file. On the board. In red marker. The evaluation read like an indictment, needs improvement, questions medical authority. Exhibits inappropriate emotional attachment to patients. Demonstrates concerning instability. Danielle read it once. Twice. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass. She carefully peeled the paper from the board, folded it once down the center, and placed it in her pocket without a word. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close to the worst part. The worst part was what Sterling had set in motion while she was reading words designed to dismantle her credibility, her career, her entire constructed life in Norfolk. Commander Torres crashed at 2,300 hours on his 12th day. Not gradually. Not with warning. His fever spiked to 104.7 degrees Fahrenheit in 90 minutes. His blood pressure dropped from stable to unstable. His lab screamed sepsis, white count climbing, lactate climbing, procalcitonin through the roof. Danielle caught the trajectory shift at 2,147 when she reviewed his imaging from that morning. The pericardial effusion had increased. The pattern was wrong. Not infection pattern. Trauma pattern. Retained foreign material in the cardiac sac. She'd seen this before. 20 years ago. In a field hospital outside Kandahar with blood on her hands and a 7-year-old boy on the table who'd been caught in crossfire between two forces that didn't care about children. The imaging pattern was identical. The retained bullet fragment, the inflammatory cascade, the way the body recognized metal as invasion and tried to wall it off until the walls collapsed. She found Sterling during morning rounds on day 12, approached him at the nurse's station where the residents could hear, where everything would be documented in the way things always are when you're building a case against someone. "Doctor, the pericardial effusion is increasing significantly," she said, keeping her voice neutral, professional, stripped of any emotional content that might sound unstable. "The imaging pattern suggests retained foreign material. We should consider advanced imaging or... What did I tell you about practicing medicine without a license?" Sterling cut her off, loud enough for the residents to note. "Stick to bedpans, Nurse Ross. Bedpans and observations you keep to yourself." The pattern in his pericardium, she tried again. "Your catastrophizing is noted in your file," he said, turning away. The finality in his voice was absolute. Case building. Evidence collection. He was past the social humiliation stage. He was in strategic sabotage now, and he was executing it with surgeons' hands. That evening, Sterling made a call from his office to the hospital board chairman, Gerald Whitmore, his golf partner of 6 years, the man he'd helped secure his position through a donation to the right political campaign. "Gerald, I need to discuss a staffing concern. Senior nurse here, competency issues, possibly credential irregularities. I filed formal reports, but I think this might require board-level attention before something happens on our watch." 23 minutes after that call, Sterling contacted the state licensing board with an anonymous tip. "I'm calling about a nurse employed at Oak Creek Memorial in Norfolk. Name is Danielle Ross. There appear to be significant gaps in her employment history, approximately 7 years unaccounted for. Possibly falsified credentials. Recommend immediate investigation." By 06:30 the next morning, an investigator named Patricia Holloway was waiting in the hospital administrator's office. She was older, professional, with the kind of tired eyes that had seen every lie medical personnel could construct. Danielle was called in at 06:45, still in her scrubs from the night shift. "Ms. Ross, we're conducting a routine credentialing audit," Holloway said, not looking up from a file. "Your paperwork shows a significant employment gap. Between 2001 and 2008, there's nothing. No W-2s, no tax returns, no employer references. Can you explain where you were during that period? The fluorescent lights buzzed. Outside the window, Norfolk was waking up. Traffic. Horns. People going to jobs they could talk about, careers that existed in documentation, lives that didn't require erasure. Danielle's hands gripped the edge of the desk. I was overseas. Humanitarian work. Humanitarian work, Holloway repeated, making notes. Which organization? It was contract-based. Through the Department of State. I'll need names of supervisors, references, documentation of employment. We'll require proof of licensing during that period. Official paperwork. Danielle's jaw tightened. She couldn't provide any of it. Operation Nightingale had been erased not by fire or deletion but by bureaucratic exactitude, redacted from every official record, her team scattered across the globe, her 7 years of service transformed into a void that official channels pretended didn't exist. The government had trained her, deployed her, trusted her with classified extraction missions in Kandahar, and when the operation ended, they'd simply removed it from existence. No medals. No records. No proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had ever been anywhere at all. I'll need to check on that, she said quietly. Holloway's pen kept moving. In the hallway outside, she could hear Sterling's voice, already making another call, already constructing the next phase. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Commander Torres's oxygen saturation was dropping at that exact moment, and his pericardium was filling with blood that nobody else had understood, and she was sitting in an office with documents she couldn't provide while a man whose only skill was institutional destruction orchestrated her removal from the one patient she might still save. Day 12 brought the first real warning, though Sterling wouldn't recognize it until it was far too late. Commander Torres's fever climbed to 103.2 degrees at 0600 hours, his body burning through antibiotics like fuel, and by noon his blood pressure had started its slow descent, 138/82 at shift change, 131/79 by afternoon, 124/71 by evening. The numbers whispered what the monitors couldn't quite scream yet, a story written in vital signs that only someone who'd read 1,000 of them in a field hospital could translate. Danielle stood at the nurse's station at 1847 hours, Commander Torres's chart open beneath her palms, her eyes moving across the data with the methodical precision of someone reading a map to disaster. Fever. Hypertension. Tachycardia climbing to 118. Muffled heart sounds documented in Sterling's own notes from morning rounds, dismissed with 3 words scrawled in the chart margin, likely post-operative edema. He was wrong. She knew he was wrong the way she'd known things were wrong in that field hospital in Kandahar, the way her hands had learned to recognize the specific architecture of a body entering cascade, the body telling its story for those trained to listen. The pericardium filling with blood. Cardiac tamponade. The retained bullet fragment, the one Sterling had pronounced insignificant on day 3, had shifted with Torres's movement during physical therapy, had migrated like a tiny predator through tissue and muscle until it found the membrane surrounding his heart. Now it was feeding on him, millimeter by millimeter, a slow drowning from the inside. She pulled up the CT imaging from admission, her finger tracing the metallic shadow that Sterling had documented as an artifact, no clinical significance, a decision that lived in his notes like a monument to misdiagnosis. The fragment was positioned at 4.2 centimeters from the cardiac wall on day 3. Danielle measured it now against the current ultrasound, and the distance had closed to 2.8 centimeters. Migration. Progression. Timeline. She photographed the screens with her phone, not for evidence, not yet, but for the clinical certainty that might save a man's life when institutional authority failed to do it. Sterling's rounds that morning had been a masterclass in confidence built on incomplete data. He'd swept into Torres's room at 0800 hours with 3 residents trailing behind him like remoras, his white coat still pressed with the crispness of someone who'd delegated his laundry to someone else, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a medal he'd purchased rather than earned. "Commander, you're looking more robust," he'd said, his voice carrying the tone of a man congratulating himself. Torres had nodded weakly, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for water, and Sterling had caught that tremor and reinterpreted it as fatigue rather than what it was, the early signature of a body recognizing its own decay. Danielle had been present, monitoring the vitals from the foot of the bed, and she'd watched Sterling miss everything, the slightly bluish tinge creeping around Torres's lips, the subtle distension of the jugular vein visible only from certain angles, the way Torres's breathing pattern had shifted from diaphragmatic to purely thoracic. Sterling had spent 6 minutes discussing Torres's post-operative pain regimen with a medical student while Torres's cardiovascular system was writing an emergency message in vital signs Sterling's medical school had taught him to read. He simply wasn't reading anymore. By 1300 hours, Danielle had moved through preparations that nobody had asked her to make. The thoracotomy kit was accessible now, not stored 3 hallways away. She'd verified the equipment herself, the satin sky vascular clamps arranged in ascending size, the 12-0 polypropylene suture for the epicardial closure, the pericardiocentesis needle kit positioned on the crash cart with the precision of a surgical field. She wasn't supposed to be preparing for procedures she wasn't authorized to perform. She wasn't supposed to be recognizing what Sterling would miss until it was far too late. But her hands had muscle memory older than her civilian identity, and that muscle memory didn't care about titles or protocols or the institutional authority of a man who'd never held a human life in his hands while shrapnel sang through the air around him. She'd worked nights at Oak Creek Memorial for 18 years without drawing attention, without ripples, and now she was creating contingencies in plain sight, placing them where her hands could reach them in darkness. Sterling's confidence was a living thing, a presence in the hospital that filled rooms the way steam filled a kettle. He'd been chief of surgery for 15 years, which meant he'd been right for 15 years about things that mattered less than getting this one diagnosis correct. He'd published papers. His patients recovered. He'd built a reputation on careful assessment and surgical precision, and that reputation had calcified into something else entirely, a certainty that existed independent of actual clinical data. When he saw Danielle at the nurses' station reviewing labs for the 5th time that day, he'd paused. Not with suspicion, but with annoyance. "Nurse, those charts have been read. Your shift ended at 1,500 hours. I trust your replacement is managing adequately without your hovering." His voice carried the particular contempt of a man who'd never learned that the most dangerous people in hospitals were the ones who noticed details he'd trained himself to skip. She'd met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "Commander's pressure is dropping. Fever's up. I'm concerned about his cardiac stability." Sterling had laughed, actually laughed, the sound of it sharp and polished and utterly devoid of humor. "His cardiac function is excellent. The echo yesterday showed normal ejection fraction. You're reading too much into normal post-operative variation." He turned away, his white coat fluttering with the motion, and Danielle had waited exactly 3 heartbeats before returning to her documentation. The night shift began at 1900 hours with Danielle assigned to the ICU floor, which meant she'd be within 90 seconds of Torres's room. Her replacement for the day shift, a nurse named Patricia with 17 years of experience but no field hospital training, had received a detailed handoff, fever trajectory, blood pressure trends, heart sounds becoming progressively more muffled despite negative cultures. Patricia had nodded, had documented it all, and had gone back to managing for other critically ill patients with the energy of someone running a marathon at a jog. By 21:45 hours, Torres's blood pressure had dropped to 98/58, his oxygen saturation holding at 94% only because of the supplemental oxygen delivering 4 liters per minute through his nasal cannula. His body was moving into the early stages of tamponade, not yet catastrophic, but moving in that direction with the inevitability of gravity. Danielle stood outside his room at 2200 hours and made the decision that would destroy everything she'd built in her civilian life. She called down to the lab and ordered a stat CBC, CMP, and lactate. She called respiratory and asked for a specialist to reassess his oxygen delivery within the hour. She documented her clinical observations in the chart with the precision and language of someone who'd never forgotten how to write a field medical assessment. And then she waited. The waiting was a familiar texture, one she'd learned in Kandahar, the specific quality of time when you've prepared everything possible and the next move belongs to circumstance. She sat in the break room from 22:30 to 23:30 hours, ostensibly on her mandated break, actually timing the progression of Torres's condition in her mind with the accuracy of someone who'd treated 18 tactical casualties in a 12-hour period. Her hands were steady because she'd learned to make them steady, because trembling was a luxury that only people with safe lives could afford. The fluorescent lights above the break room hummed their plastic frequency, and the smell of burnt coffee from the morning pot still hanging in the air couldn't quite mask the clinical smell of antiseptic that permeated everything at Oak Creek Memorial. Around her, the hospital moved through its night rhythm, quieter than daylight, but never truly silent, never truly resting. Sterling was in the physician's lounge at 2,245 hours, according to the sign-in board, which meant he was somewhere on the premises. Good. She needed him present for what was coming. At 2,300 hours, Torres's oxygen saturation dropped to 91%. At 2,315 hours, it fell to 88%. The numbers were moving like a countdown now, not the slow decline of yesterday but the sharper descent of a system beginning to fail. Danielle was walking past Torres's room at exactly 23:19 when the cardiac monitor began its particular scream, the sound of electrical rhythm fragmenting, the signature of a heart that couldn't fill, couldn't pump, was drowning in its own fluid. She didn't run. Running attracted attention. She moved with purpose, with the specific gait of someone responding to protocol, and she was in Torres's room before the second alarm sounded. His neck veins were distended, bulging like hydraulic lines under pressure. His skin had taken on the grey-purple pallor of someone whose oxygen saturation was now 84%, and his eyes were open but unfocused, the look of a consciousness trying to understand why his body was failing. Danielle hit the code button, and the hospital's mechanical response activated, the overhead page crackling with code blue, ICU bed 7, the crash cart arriving from down the hall pushed by two residents who looked barely old enough to shave. She grabbed the pericardiocentesis kit herself, her hands moving with the choreography of muscle memory that had been trained in field conditions far more austere than this. The needle, 18-gauge angiocath, equipment that was the same whether you were using it in Kandahar or Norfolk, came out of the kit smooth and ready. She prepped the fourth intercostal space with antiseptic swabs, the smell of it sharp and familiar, the texture of his skin beneath her fingers the same as it would have been on any body, any circumstance. Sterling arrived at 2,322 hours, still pulling on gloves, his face registering confusion before it registered fury. "Step away from that patient right now," he said, and his voice cracked in the middle of the sentence, which told her everything, that he knew he'd missed something catastrophic, that he could see it now written across Torres's vital signs, that his 15-year reputation was unraveling in real time. "You are not authorized to perform any procedure on this patient. Step away or security will remove you." But Danielle was already positioned, needle angled at the precise degree between rib and rib, the anatomical pathway she'd used 200 times in a place where there were no protocols, only survival. "If I don't do this now, he dies in 90 seconds, she said, and her voice came out perfectly flat, perfectly devoid of emotion, perfectly authoritative. Sterling lurched toward her, his hand reaching for her shoulder, and she felt the weight of his authority colliding with the weight of her training, felt the moment before it shifted into something else entirely. The needle went in with a distinct resistance change of penetrating the pericardial membrane. The syringe began filling with blood immediately, dark blood, old blood, the evidence of the fragment's migration written in fluid. 200 ccs. 230. The monitor responded before Sterling could complete whatever he was saying, the cardiac rhythm stabilizing, Torres's oxygen saturation climbing back toward acceptable ranges. The room went absolutely silent for 3 full seconds, and then Sterling's face transformed into something that looked like a mask cracking. "You just ended your career," he said, his voice tight and controlled in a way that meant it wasn't controlled at all. "You physically assaulted me. You performed an unauthorized invasive procedure. Security." 2 guards appeared within 5 minutes, summoned by Sterling himself, and Danielle removed her gloves slowly, methodically, the way she'd learned to do everything, without rush, without emotion, without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her disturbed by the consequences of saving a life that protocol had decided wasn't worth saving. The cardiac monitor's alarm screamed at 2 a.m. like a wounded animal caught in a steel trap. Danielle was already moving before the second beep, muscle memory from 20 years ago flooding back through her nervous system, taking over where conscious thought was too slow. Distended neck veins. Blood pooling in the pericardial space. Cardiac tamponade. The boy's, no, the commander's, heart was drowning in its own fluid while Dr. Sterling stood motionless at the doorway, still processing the alarm as if it were background noise. She grabbed the thoracotomy kit with hands that didn't shake, didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission. The 14-gauge angiocath needle caught the fluorescent light as she prepped the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Sterling was still pulling on his gloves when she plunged the needle through the chest wall with the precision of someone who had done this before under far worse conditions, in a burning MRAP with artillery rounds punching through canvas, with morphine rationed to single milligrams, with her own blood type on file because the blood bank had been destroyed. The hiss of air escaping. The sudden gasp from Commander Torres's lungs as pressure released from around his heart. O2 sat climbing, 68, 72, 78. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm like a prayer answered. Blood pressure stabilizing. Heart rate dropping from the panicked gallop of a dying man to something that resembled normal human physiology. Sterling's face had gone the color of old parchment. He moved toward the patient, but Danielle had already stepped back, already peeling off her gloves with deliberate slowness, the way she'd learned to do everything in this hospital, never fast, never aggressive, never giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her disturbed. Her voice came out flat and level, barely above a whisper, his stabilized. You'll want imaging to confirm fluid reaccumulation. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact delivered by someone who had held entire operating theaters together with her own two hands while bombs fell outside. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. Then he turned without a word and reached for the phone clip to his badge. By morning, Danielle understood the full architecture of his revenge. The hospital board chairman called at 8:06 a.m. She heard about it from a younger nurse who looked terrified to even make eye contact. They're saying you performed an unauthorized procedure outside your scope of practice. An anonymous tip had reached the state licensing board at 6:15 a.m. claiming falsified credentials. An investigator from the Department of Health appeared at Oak Creek Memorial's HR office at 9:44 a.m. with a badge and a folder and questions designed to trap her in contradictions. Your employment records show you worked in trauma care from 1998 to 2004. What were your specific responsibilities? What training certifications were required? How did you obtain military medical credentials in civilian practice? She couldn't answer without breaking her cover. Operation Nightingale had been wiped from official records, not classified in the traditional sense, but erased, scrubbed, the kind of thing that never appeared in any official documentation because officially it had never happened. Her team was scattered. Her records were marked as sealed under federal authority. Her training was documented in files that didn't exist. Security escorted her out at noon. The same guard who had dragged her away from saving Commander Torres's life was the one holding the cardboard box with her belongings, her stethoscope, her small collection of trauma shears, the photo of her daughter at graduation. She walked through the lobby of Oak Creek Memorial knowing every staff member was watching, the physics of humiliation pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight. Her daughter Emma had called during the escort, "Mom, where are you? Why isn't the hospital letting me call you anymore?" She couldn't explain. Not yet. That evening, Emma found her at the kitchen table still wearing her scrubs jacket, the one with the faded Coast Guard Special Operations patch sewn inside the lining, hidden where no one was supposed to see it. The patch was from a unit that didn't officially exist, commemorating a mission that had never been authorized, recognizing a service no one was allowed to acknowledge. Danielle's hands rested flat on the table, staring at the patch like it was an artifact from another lifetime. Tears slid down her cheeks without sound, the kind of crying that comes from exhaustion deeper than bone, from the accumulated weight of 20 years of carrying secrets that cost her everything each time she tried to help. "Mom." Emma's voice cracked. "Mom, what happened? Why did they fire you?" Danielle couldn't answer. How do you tell your daughter that you saved a life and lost your career? How do you explain Kandahar to someone who grew up in Norfolk? How do you admit that the boy you pulled from rubble in a field hospital nearly 2 decades ago had grown into the commander you recognized the moment they wheeled him into the ICU, and that recognizing him had signed your professional death warrant? Emma sat beside her and held her hand, terrified by her mother's silence. By 11 p.m., Commander Torres regained consciousness and asked for the nurse with the steady hands. A younger nurse, intimidated by his tone, told him she was no longer at the hospital. He tried to sit up despite the falls, despite the wound vac still draining from his surgical site. What do you mean, she's gone? Where is she? No one had an answer for him. They just medicated him back to sleep. The next morning at 9 a.m., Danielle was filling out an application for a grocery store cashier position when Emma burst through the door of their kitchen like the house was on fire. Mom! MOM! Turn on the news. There are military trucks at Oak Creek Memorial. Like, a lot of them. Danielle looked up slowly, her fingers still hovering over the printed application form. She'd learned long ago not to flinch at sudden movement, not to let surprise register on her face, but watching the live newsfeed transform Oak Creek Memorial into a military operations center made something shift behind her ribs. A convoy of Coast Guard vehicles, she counted 5 vehicles, 2 of them with armed personnel establishing a perimeter, one with the distinctive markings of a command vehicle. Navy blue and white. The unit insignia. The rotor wash from a helicopter landing in the parking lot. No, she whispered. Her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. They can't. I'm burned. We're all burned. Emma stared at her mother. Mom, what are you talking about? What's burned? But Danielle was already moving, already grabbing her keys with the muscle memory of a soldier responding to a radio call, knowing that whatever had happened at Oak Creek Memorial, someone had broken protocol. Someone had declassified something. Someone had decided that a quiet nurse hiding in plain sight was worth bringing into the light. And that meant 20 years of invisible service was about to become very, very visible. She drove toward Oak Creek Memorial with her hand steady on the wheel, her eyes forward, her mind running through scenarios like a computer processing code. The lobby had transformed when she arrived, boots on tile, radio static crackling through encrypted channels, personnel wearing the insignia of Coast Guard Special Operations Command. The air pressure in the room changed when she stepped through the doors. Then she saw the stretcher. The man was bearded, Middle Eastern features, wrapped in a civilian blanket, and the moment his eyes found her face, he began screaming in rapid Pashto, words tumbling over each other like water breaking through a dam. A translator rushed forward, but the man switched to broken English with the intensity of someone delivering a message that couldn't wait for perfect language, the Angel of Kandahar. The Angel. I know you. He was pointing at her with both hands, tears streaming down his face. You pulled 17 of my men from the fire after the airstrike. Treated enemy and ally the same. You gave us water, morphine, your own blood. His voice broke on the last words. My village lit candles for you for 20 years. We called you the Angel. The hospital staff froze. Nurses stopped moving. Doctors stepped back. Sterling was near the nurses' station, his face draining of color like someone watching his entire professional reputation evaporate in real time. Then Commander Torres appeared from the ICU corridor against every medical protocol that should have kept him in bed, trailing for lines like pale gray tendrils, his surgical wound still fresh beneath his hospital gown. His voice came out rough and broken and absolutely certain, Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross, at attention. Danielle's body responded before her mind caught up, spine straightening, shoulders back, feet positioned exactly hip-width apart, hands at her sides in the stance she'd held for 12 years of military service and 20 years of forgetting. The transformation was instantaneous. The nurse disappeared. The senior chief emerged. A Coast Guard captain stepped forward, a man with silver at his temples and the bearing of someone who'd made decisions that cost lives, carrying a manila folder like it contained proof of resurrection. These files were declassified at 0600 this morning. You're authorized to read them." Her hands trembled as she took the folder, not from fear, but from the weight of 20 years finally being acknowledged. The first page showed her own face 20 years younger, next to her military identification number, beneath text stamped top secret / no phone. She opened the folder slowly, reading mission reports she'd never seen, casualty counts, after-action analyses, official records of operations that officially had never occurred. 2 silver stars for Valor under fire, the captain said quietly. The nurses gasped. Some pulled out their phones. A female lieutenant commander stepped forward, her voice crisp and official, for Bronze Stars with Valor for actions in Kandahar Province, Helmand Province, and Kuna Province. Danielle's vision blurred. She kept reading, kept turning pages, kept seeing the history of her own service documented in military bureaucracy for the first time in 2 decades. A Navy Cross, a grizzled Master Chief said, his voice like gravel and engine oil, she couldn't receive because officially she was never there. Security's footsteps echoed down the corridor at noon. 2 guards, efficient and impersonal, escorted Danielle from the 4th floor with her cardboard box balanced against her chest. Her name badge was already gone, her access credentials terminated with 3 mouse clicks in some HR office she'd never seen. The other nurses looked away as she passed, not from malice, but from the particular shame of watching someone disappear from a place they'd become invisible in the first place. She'd been at Oak Creek Memorial for 18 years. They took her in 70 seconds. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Rain hammered the windshield like the helicopter rotors from Kandahar, that particular percussion that lived in her bones. Danielle pulled into her driveway at 12:44 p.m. and sat in the car with her hands on the steering wheel, watching water stream down the glass. The cardboard box smelled like photocopier toner and failure. At the kitchen table, still wearing her scrubs and jacket, Danielle opened the box. Her water bottle. A stress ball shaped like a heart. The photo of Emma from graduation. And at the bottom, carefully preserved, the faded Coast Guard Special Operations patch sewn into the lining of her jacket, 20 years old, the embroidery fraying at the edges, the only physical proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had ever existed outside of classified records so deeply buried that even the Pentagon pretended she was fiction. She pressed her forehead against the kitchen table and let the tears come, silent and steady, her shoulders moving in a rhythm she recognized from a different lifetime. The kind of crying that soldiers did, no sound, no drama, just the body's way of releasing what the mind refused to speak aloud. She'd lost everything. Twice. The first time had been by choice. The second time, she hadn't seen coming. Her daughter didn't find her sitting there at 3 in the morning the next day. Emma found her at 6 a.m. when she stopped by before work with fresh coffee, and the first thing she said was, "Mom, turn on the news. There are military trucks at the hospital." Danielle's hands moved before her brain caught up. She found the remote. The screen flickered to life showing Oak Creek Memorial's main entrance, and what emerged from the pre-dawn darkness was a Coast Guard convoy that looked like something out of a classified operation, for hums, their running lights cutting through the rain like sabers, and behind them, 2 MH-60M Blackhawks sitting on the grass of the hospital's front lawn with their rotors spinning slow and deliberate. "What did you do?" Emma whispered. "Nothing," Danielle said. But her voice had changed. It was lower now. It was the voice of someone who'd just recognized the sound of her own extraction team. The convoy didn't stop at the emergency department. It proceeded directly to the ICU, where Commander Torres lay with his chest still wrapped in surgical tape, his oxygen saturation still climbing from the pericardiocentesis that shouldn't have worked but did. A former Taliban commander emerged from one of the Blackhawks on a stretcher, his movements careful, his eye scanning the hospital corridors with the precision of a man who'd learned long ago to memorize exits. He saw Danielle in the ICU waiting area. His face went white. He began shouting in Pashto, his voice cracking with something between gratitude and grief, "The angel of Kandahar." The nurse with steady hands. "She pulled 17 of my men from the fire after the airstrike, treated enemy and ally the same, made no distinction, gave no preference." His interpreter stood frozen, unsure whether to translate words that were already reshaping the entire narrative of this hospital, this moment, this woman standing perfectly still in scrubs that were no longer her armor but her evidence. Torres emerged from his room trailing for lines, his movement deliberate and ceremonial, his eyes locked on Danielle with the recognition of a child recognizing the person who'd held him together when the world was coming apart. His voice rang out across the ICU with the precision of military command, "Senior Chief, at attention." The room went so quiet the ventilators seemed to scream. Danielle moved into parade rest, her feet shoulder-width apart, her hands clasped behind her back, and 30 nurses and administrators and orderlies witnessed the transformation of the quiet woman they dismissed into something else entirely. A Coast Guard captain approached with a file folder sealed with red tape, the kind of document that didn't exist, the kind of record that classified people preferred to pretend was fiction. "Senior Chief Ross," the captain began, and the use of her actual title felt like receiving oxygen after suffocation. "Your service record has been declassified. Effective immediately." He placed the file on the ICU counter. Danielle didn't open it. She didn't need to. She already knew what was inside. 2 silver stars. The captain paused, letting that land. Bronze star with Valor. Another pause. 1 more. 2 more bronze stars with Valor. The room was barely breathing. And a Navy Cross. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Senior Chief Ross held a forward operating medical position in Kandahar province for 16 consecutive hours under sustained enemy fire, the captain continued, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of bureaucratic delay. She performed 247 surgical interventions in a structure with no walls, no backup, no support. 17 of her personnel were killed around her. She didn't leave until every patient was evacuated. 203 military personnel and civilians evacuated alive. 203, Senior Chief. He looked at the file. Official count was 147. The rest were classified. The rest were people nobody was supposed to know existed. The captain met her eyes. "Your medals were earned. Your service was real. Your country is sorry it took 20 years to say thank you." Sterling's face, watching from his office window 3 floors up, went the color of bone. What happened next in Sterling's office took exactly 17 minutes. The board chairman arrived with 2 security escorts, and his expression suggested he already knew what was coming. The Coast Guard legal officer and Special Agent Chen from Naval Criminal Investigative Service were already seated when Sterling walked in, and they spread his own words across his desk like indictment evidence, emails, texts, voicemails, every communication he'd made to destroy the woman who'd saved the patient he was supposed to save. "You investigated a classified operative," Chen said, her voice flat as a warrant. "That triggered automatic intelligence monitoring. Every call you made was recorded. Every contact you leveraged was flagged. You built a file, Dr. Sterling. We've been reading it with great interest." The board chairman leaned forward. That unauthorized procedure, the needle decompression, saved Commander Torres's life. Our consultant reviewed the case. He had 7 minutes before cardiac arrest became irreversible. Your team was still in the cafeteria. She did what you couldn't do fast enough. She performed outside her scope, Sterling tried, but his voice was already breaking. The air in the room had become something physical, pressing down on him like the weight of 17 buried complaints that had just been unburied by people with security clearances and no interest in his golf handicap. Another board member slid forward 17 files. "We also found something interesting when NCIS started digging. 17 formal complaints against you over the past decade. 3 nurses transferred. 2 residents quit. A pattern of retaliation against staff who questioned your judgment, all mysteriously buried in HR files that shouldn't have been accessible but were." The board member's voice was cold. That system worked. Until it didn't. Sterling's hand shook as security appeared at the door. The same guard who'd escorted Danielle out the day before. He held a cardboard box, and Sterling understood in that moment what it felt like to be unmade by the exact machinery he'd constructed to unmake someone else. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," the guard said, and the satisfaction in his voice was the only mercy he was going to receive. 3 months later, patients reported seeing Sterling at a folding table outside a strip mall pharmacy in downtown Norfolk, selling supplemental insurance policies, his medical license suspended pending investigation into 19 complaints that had been mysteriously preserved in databases nobody was supposed to be able to access. Nobody stopped to talk to him. He'd become invisible in a different way. Inside Oak Creek Memorial's main auditorium, Danielle stood in her Coast Guard dress uniform for the first time in 20 years, the blue fabric fitting like the past made physical, every medal hanging exactly where it belonged. Emma sat in the front row, finally understanding who her mother actually was, tears streaming down her face as the Coast Guard captain prepared to pin the Navy Cross on her mother's chest. Commander Torres stood at Danielle's right side in his own dress uniform, his hand raised in salute, the 7-year-old boy and the warrior he'd become united in this singular moment. Behind them, 73 members of the Coast Guard Special Operations community stood at attention, the team she'd bled with, the people she'd held together in that field hospital in Kandahar while the world tried to pretend they didn't exist. Emma was called to the stage to adjust her mother's medals. Her hands trembled as she straightened the Navy Cross. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, though the microphone carried it across the auditorium. Danielle's response was quiet, measured, the voice of a woman who'd been silent for exactly 20 years, because heroes don't talk about what they've done. They just keep showing up. The audience rose in standing ovation. The sound filled the auditorium like helicopter rotors, loud, insistent, undeniable proof that she'd existed all along, that the quiet nurse they'd never noticed was the angel of Kandahar they'd been reading about in declassified reports that suddenly mattered again. If you've ever worked beside someone and never knew who they really were, subscribe and let us know in the comments. Like this video. And remember, not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs.